Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined today by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. I'm not going to mention the weather. How are you doing today, Josh?
I'm doing pretty all right. I'm doing okay.
All right, good. Well, you know, we recorded late last week and are recording early this week just because of our enthusiasm for the work we do.
It's not even a joke.
That's not even a joke.
I almost said to you last week on Thursday when we finished recording, should we just record another one or should we come in tomorrow and record another one?
Should we just get Darren out of here and record another one?
Let's do another one. It's like, yeah.
Well, you know, we recorded late last week with Darren Shaw, our comrade in arms when it comes to the polling, among other things. So not a lot of time has passed since our initial discussion of our June poll, but as we're discussing, that's kind of the point. There's a lot in the poll. There's a lot going on. And while we managed to cover a lot of ground last week with Darren, much of that discussion was understandably focused on the impeachment and trial of suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton. I'm thinking today we can try to accomplish a couple of overlapping goals. So one, step back a bit, look at what the poll tells us overall about views of the legislature in the wake of the regular session and how much those views now are a break from what we usually see or not. And along the way, kind of touch on some of the results that we didn't quite get to last week. And just generally kind of think about what the poll told us about views of the legislature and views of legislative performance. As we record this today, I think we have every expectation that the first special session called by the governor is going to, peter out this week. The clock's going to run out without anything having gotten done. And we ended the last podcast talking about the support for specific policy proposals that we tested in the poll. And we were talking about those views, I think not just among Republicans, but among Texans overall, and looking at the comparatively lower levels of enthusiasm and confidence in the legislature when we asked about approval for the legislature's behavior in broader policy areas. Now, where I think we want to land today is to also look at some of our more specific, our results on some of the more specific policy proposals, which we hit last time and talked about a bit. But that dynamic is interesting, as we've been talking about, both in terms of, kind of some of the subtleties at work here in polling, but also in terms of talking about the broader crosscurrents in public opinion on policy performance, right? So let's unspool that. I think we want to start, most directly, if we're going to talk about how people view the legislature, we should just start with overall job approval, which we've asked a bunch of times. And just to do that quickly, overall job approval, 33% approve, 40% disapprove, which is on the low end of what we've seen over the last 6 or so sessions, right?
Yeah, we've seen, again, we've been doing this for a while now, and so we can make good comparison points at sort of the June polling, end of session, and approval, over this time period, over 10 years, has ranged between a low of 28% and a high of about 42%. Disapprovals range between 29% and 48%. We can talk about which years those were, but it's a little bit too much depth here.
Yeah,
strangely enough.
Let's not get too deep.
Let's not get too deep on this. Now
it's almost 4th of July.
Well, I just want to, and again, it's interesting because I think there are a couple sort of quick take reactions to some of these types of numbers that I think are fair if you don't dig into it very much.
Right.
And one of, I think and we're going to address both of those reactions today. So one reaction about the general numbers might be to say, hey, yeah, well, of course, approval numbers are a little bit low. They're in a special session. They didn't do what they said they were going to do. And then generally, I think I'm sort of feeling like this is probably true, although I need to I'm going to say this is a guess, although I think the data probably is supporting this.
Mm-hmm.
The longer the legislature's around, it generally doesn't add to, positive evaluation. I'm not saying it's impossible. It depends on the circumstances, I think, in which the legislature gets called back. But if you think about the last session, and again, the circumstances were very different, having multiple special sessions that time and the causes of those special sessions, both from a policy and a practical
the Democrats breaking quorum in 2021 definitely colored that.
Right. But I think, interestingly enough, given how often we talk about how little people pay attention to this stuff, it seems like in a state that sort of expects its government to be at least somewhat limited and only kind of there and active for a long period of time, the longer they stay around, it does seem to start to test people's patience a bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting response. I mean, I think.
It's actually let me just finish the point. It's a little bit of. It's not a straw man, but it's a little bit of it. I think that's out there. And I think that is definitely, it's coloring some of the negativity. But I think the point is you got to dive into the numbers and say, well, wait a minute. Is this just because, they haven't succeeded on some of the things they say they were going to succeed on, or is this more broad?
Yeah.
And when you start to look at this data, and as we're going to go into a little bit deeper, what you find is that the discontent is a little bit more broadly distributed and more focused on a number of areas at this point that's not just about property taxes.
Right. Because it's more broadly distributed, there's a lot more places for people to rest. To park, I shouldn't say rest, to park their, look, this is Texas, and we are living in the moment that we're in. I think that's a good way of putting it. That broader array that we can look at, in part because we poll on so damn many things,
right.
But also, it gives a lot of different people different places to park their discontent, and that discontent, I think, is part political culture in the state and part the immediate kind of circumstances. I mean, if you go back to that range of approval numbers that you talked about,
mm-hmm.
I mean, nothing in that range said, well, there have been times when 70% of Texans approved of what the legislature was doing.
Exactly. But so, and this is the point, though. So when we start to, we'll keep kind of coming back to this. Now, look, wouldn't be surprising to say, yeah, there's overwhelming disapproval among Democrats because Democrats are out of power, so their voters are negative. But a majority, but the plurality of the sample is made up of Republicans because the plurality of voters in the state are made up of Republicans. And when we look at their numbers, it's not as though they're brimming with approval of what's gone on here, right? And so what we see is we find, 50% in total GOP approval of the job the legislature has done. Only 9% of that is strong approval, right? Oh, I'm sorry. Is that wrong? Do I have that right?
Yeah. Well, I didn't know if you were looking at something else from
I'm looking at the wrong notes?
From your
41%
notes.
I'm sorry.
It's 52%. It's what I have is 52% approve.
Right.
But, the point I think you're heading to is that 42% of Republicans only approve somewhat. Right. Only 10% of Republicans approve strongly, which is interesting, but also not totally off the line.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, not totally off the line. What's interesting about it is, when you think about it, if I was sitting here and I'm like trying, just putting myself in the position of, sort of, let's say, a Republican leader in the state, knowing that I have total control over the agenda, I have the votes to pass what I want to pass, I can't look at these numbers and say, home run. The other piece of this that's interesting is you've got about, a quarter of Republicans who are just kind of not offering up an opinion at this point or not holding one about it, which is also kind of problematic given the role that sort of mobilization in this state plays. So it's not a ringing endorsement. And I think what you're going to see as we kind of go into these numbers a little bit more is that, it's hard to just say, well, this is about the special session. This is about the fact that they didn't do this, they're going to do. But it's like, as we start to dig into these numbers, these pockets of discontent where I think if you're a Republican leader in the state, you wouldn't expect there to keep popping up. And that's, I think that's what's sort of, so interesting here in a lot of ways. And I think it does relate in some ways to policy, but in a complicated way.
Right. So I think, one last kind of point, a couple of small points about the general, these kind of general reads. You kind of, you put it forth as a little bit of a straw man, and I think that's right, but only a little bit. I think two things to note here is, one thing that we notice probably maybe more closely, and maybe in being fair, we overestimate it a little bit. But I think again, as you were saying, I could find data certainly on media use patterns to back this up. Yeah. You know, whether the coverage is intensely negative or, you know, whatever the tone of the coverage allowing for, you know, eliminating outliers, you know, as summer, you know, sets in, and then you've got a special session, and this is the point I'm saying from our, you know, reflects our experience, a lot of the local news television stations are covering what's going on, the fact of the special session, what's going on. And, you know, that's bound to be a little bit negative, and it taps into, again, both the negativity of the moment, as I was saying earlier, and activates that kind of wellspring of negative predispositions towards government or mediocre predispositions towards government in the legislature. And I think that's one, you know, so there's that. And then the other piece, just to kind of peel off something, that's the traditional media piece. Yeah. And then there's the social media piece, which is, you know, I mean, if you're somebody who is still on Twitter, and we said this, or watching social media, you know, one of the arguments being proffered for this dissatisfaction by interested parties on the, you know, on the far end of the far right end of the Republican Party is that this is a result of dissatisfaction among conservatives and the fact that conservatives are, you know, the people that are really feeling betrayed on this, and that is not indicated in the data. Yeah,
there's no. I mean, what I love is, first of all, that argument is made at the end of every single session, no matter what.
Yeah, certainly for the last, you know,
5 to 6 sessions. This idea that somehow the far right has been let down, and therefore they're upset. Now, we ask a bunch of questions to kind of get at this. We ask about, you know, whether or not whether or not Republican elected officials are conservative enough or not. We ask this among Republicans, and we look at, you know, the views of extreme conservatives and everybody else, and there's not a lot of sense that Republicans are not being conservative enough. And when we look at the results across, you know, multiple dimensions of evaluation, it's not as though, you know, the extreme, you know, the people who are identify as the most conservative in the sample hold less positive views than Republicans overall. In fact, for the most part, they hold more positive views.
It's the opposite.
Yeah, look, I mean, if you look at some of the policies that are pursuing that are the most controversial, those are direct shots to this group of voters. And it's not as though they aren't, you know, they don't look like Republicans. I mean, for the most part, again, the majority trajectory within the Republican Party is aligned with these extreme conservatives. But when we look at evaluations of the legislature in these key areas, and, you know, reactions to policies, you know, this is the target market for lots of these guys and gals are basically fine.
Right. And look, I think it's important to really underline that. Yeah. I mean, and underline the fact that they're, you know, the data on this are pretty unambiguous. I mean, if you look at those underneath the hood of those legislative approval numbers that we were just talking about, you know, as you say, people that identify as extremely conservative on our 7-point ideology scale, the approval level is, you know, the aggregate approval level is highest among those who say they're extremely conservative, and the overall disapproval level is highest among those who say they only lean conservative. So it's actually the opposite of that narrative.
Right, exactly. And this is, look, and like, you know, it's like there's sort of a duh. But I mean, we're trying to, you know, disentangle what people say about the electorate and what's actually going on here. And the thing is, we've been talking about this for a while. After, you know, at this point now, let's just say 2 sessions in a row that really leaned heavily conservative, and a lot of the focus that was, I would say, highlighted by the media, highlighted by leadership, made to be, you know, presented in a positive light to these voters. You know, what you end up with, and we've talked about a lot of times, there's not a lot of low-hanging fruit here for, like, you know, conservative-leaning Republican voters. You know, ultimately, a lot of the stuff that they've been going after the last couple of years have been enacted. We have permitless carry. We have a ban on abortion. And so at this point, you find yourself reaching for, like, you know, things like, I mean, you know, we can, not to, whatever, I'm just going to say, you know, like gender-affirming care. And you start worrying about what books are in the libraries. And this starts to make these sort of, you know, conservative by nature, but not not overwhelmingly ideological Republicans a little bit squeamish. And you see that in the data.
Yeah, and you're beginning to search for either those niche issues or, you know, you're looking to open up kind of new beachheads, if you will.
But here's the real issue with this. When you're searching for niche issues, the problem becomes how do those niche issues align or fail to align with people's overall evaluations about the direction of the state and about areas of big policy.
Right.
And I think that's where you can start to say, like, well, we sort of ended with this last week. Well, when we look at the specific policy areas, we see a lot of approval for these policy areas. But as we pointed out last week, that's endogenous to the process, right? Not only to the overall, it depends on, regardless of what time frame you look at, and there's 2 points to this. One, its very introduction to the process at the beginning is a reflection of the fact that these are issues that leadership have determined based on the coalitional politics within the state are winning issues for them, whether because it's overwhelmingly popular with Republicans, it's overwhelmingly popular with Republicans and breaks off a significant number of Democrats, or in some cases, it's just overwhelmingly popular with the most conservative voters in the electorate, right? But then also, then we learn about these policies. We hear that these are going on, and then what happens? They get refined throughout the process to become even more palatable to the electorate, right? And so we see this in the terms of like the most obvious example that comes to mind is the drag show bill, right?
Yeah, right.
So prohibiting, drag performances, in public places in front of a minor. And then over time, that bill became, well, let's just prohibit sexually explicit performances in public places in front of a minor. And just like, look, even if you don't study public opinion, you could understand how this very specific, instance of saying, drag shows are the same. The idea of we're going to put into law a definition of drag shows so that we keep minors away from this. And some very funny testimony, to be quite honest, if you watched it, in terms of people, a lot of Democrats asking people, well, where did you see a drag show? On the internet. So you watch drag shows on the internet, these funny interactions to like, hey, look, who's against, keeping sexually explicit performances?
Right, exactly. In some ways it's some kind of combination of, all the discussion of 20 or 30 years ago about a subtle shift in language or to something, the semiotics of this are pretty basic, right? In terms of saying, look, you start off saying drag shows loudly, and children, to saying sexually explicit, a broader category, but you crank up the exposure to kids. And, why wouldn't that work?
Yeah, and also
in stark political terms.
Right. Well, and I mean, something you have to ask yourself, regardless. I think if you're listening to this, you're obviously probably have a pretty developed ideology. But the thing you need to do is you need to sweep that away for a second and say, forgetting, downstream consequences, second and third order, argumentations about these things. Does that sound like a reasonable policy? And you know what? To most people, it's going to sound like reasonable policy. But the question is that a policy that addresses a broader area of concern in terms of the way that people are thinking about the state and thinking about the issues, or is it so niche that it doesn't really address it?
Right. And there's, what I like about that point, and as we were talking about how to approach this a little bit for the discussion, is that, what that brings out is the nature, one important aspect of political discourse, right? Which is it's recursive.
Yeah.
There's a bit of ongoing trial and error or, whatever your sort of figure of speech is. On something like that, particularly in the middle of a session, you're kind of building the airplane while you're flying it. In terms of going, we're going to start this way, and the process is going to play out.
Yeah.
And through what we think of as some of the normal mechanisms of the legislative process and the public response to the legislative process, you make course adjustments, pass these compromise bills, and then declare victory.
Right.
And,
or the plane never gets off the ground.
Right. And or it crashes.
Yeah.
right. Depending on,
I love that.
There's a lot of different ways to torture that metaphor. So let's, let's put a little, let's put a little bit of meat on these bones, but I do want to flag at this point, production note. We will post this. We're going to probably go through a few more numbers. We've talked about some numbers already. If you're listening to this on one of the podcasting platforms, as always, we'll have a post at the Texas Politics Project website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. You may have to write this down. Follow the polling link. You'll see a link, a menu choice to go to the blog. The podcast, the supplemental, podcast plus post will be in that blog section, and we'll have links and graphics. So let's talk a little bit about these. So legislative efforts. You were talking about, sort of general policy areas a minute ago versus these specific proposals that evolve more specifically in the process and the cross currents we see in this data. So let's start with kind of the bad news in a way. So legislative efforts in general policy areas that we tested. We looked at 16 policy areas in the poll.
Right.
And the legislature's efforts failed to earn approval from a majority of Texas voters in any of those policy areas. Only 3 policy areas found more voters approving than disapproving, that is in net positive territory, of the job performance of state leaders and the legislature.
Yeah, and I mean, beyond that, I mean, we'd say, go further and say 7 of those issues saw, a net negative approval between, -1 and -7 points, and 6 issues saw a gap of 10 points or more where, the share disapproved by 10 points or more than the share who approved. But here's the real problem when you look at this. Now, again, take a step back. It'd be very easy to say, I'll just put this out there real quick and then we'll move on. Was Democratic disapproval overwhelming for almost all of these issues? Yes, as we would expect. But there are only 5 issues in which 50% or more of Republicans approve of how the legislature did on these issues, right? So 5 of the 16 areas, okay? No issue saw net positive approval among independents. And, we brought this up a little bit last week, but this is important for those who follow political geography in the state, right? Only 2 issues saw net positive evaluations in the suburbs. And the issue that was sort of one of the higher ones, the economy, that's not really in control of the legislature. I mean, ultimately, sort of, in some ways, the legislature benefits from the fact that, inflation has been cooling a little bit over this time period. And so in some ways, that's almost just a benefit they get. It might be worse if it weren't for that.
So they're getting the benefit of the economy, and for the most part, the Democrats are getting blamed for the downside.
Right. Yeah. So that's
for, the lag, et cetera, et cetera. And just to give people a sense of what we're talking about here. We're talking about policy areas because we'll move on in a second. In terms of the language on the poll, we're talking about asking people about things, and I'm just kind of randomly pulling these, so that you could get a sense of the generality. Abortion policy, school safety, health care, K through 12 education, mental health services, the electric grid. And what you'll notice is there's no directionality in those terms. We're just saying, thinking about this general policy area,
based on what you've heard,
based on what what do you think? And so you're to be fair to some degree, without discounting. And I think the way that you said where the different level, the extent of disapproval was, we're picking up on what is still a generally negative political environment to some extent.
Yeah, and I think
the legislature it's fair to say the legislature hasn't really helped themselves on that.
Well, and this is sort of the thing. I mean, if we sort of think of I don't know how to like say this out in any sort of metaphor. We use a lot of metaphors here, but the things I'm thinking about are 3 sort of buckets, right? And it sort of spans time and space a little bit, right? And one is something we talk about.
Buckets that span time and space.
Buckets that span time and space. Well, that's what happens when you don't have a good metaphor at hand, okay? Okay, sir.
I like it. No.
And so
it, actually.
So one thing we haven't brought up here, but we bring up a lot is, and we talked about this a little bit last week, but just was the overwhelming sort of negative assessments towards institutions broadly that have been going on for a number of years now, right? And we've talked about sort of the right direction, wrong track numbers. We see about a majority of Texans who for a while now have said the state's on the wrong track, negative evaluations of institutions of all kind. And it's sometimes, we've talked about this previously, because I would say this. I was thinking about this morning, and I like to be fair. It's not as though both parties over time haven't contributed in one way or another to sort of fomenting a certain amount of antipathy towards traditional American institutions. And even though the right has been much more at the forefront of this recently, you can think back not long ago. Yeah. And again, I would say also, a lot of the time that these are, this is the nature of a pluralistic system. To the extent that, there's antipathy on the right towards all institutions, let's say, that's a small share of Republicans, but it's part of the discourse.
Right.
To the extent that there's antipathy, let's say, on the left towards like capitalism,
that's
there. It's a small share, but it's still.
Look, I would summarize that by saying, look, a generation ago, maybe a little bit more, so I get older, systemic critique was much more in the United States, was much more a feature of the left than the right.
Right.
As we fast forward to the present, there's at least parity.
Right.
And perhaps even, they're moving in different directions for the most part. But
Right. And so I think, if you think about what is the broadest context we could look at, we could say there's these incredibly negative and increasingly negative evaluations of all institutions. And we'd asked the question a couple times, throughout the course of, as we've been watching public opinion in this space develop, how long can you criticize institutions, let's say as the party that's in charge of all the institutions broadly, and not have that eventually seep into your own actions?
Right.
And then we look at this, right, which is saying, okay, let's look at broad evaluation of the legislature, how they did. Let's look at evaluations in all these areas. And then you find, again, really negative evaluations for the most part, and that's the central thrust. And then we have to come to this third piece, which was like, well, yeah, but they deal in concrete policies. So what are the reactions to those policies? And there, what's interesting, this is maybe the most complicated piece of this, which is to say, yeah, in general, they're relatively positive. But this is where we need to kind of go into some speculation, right? This is where the politics of this really, comes to the fore. And so let's talk a little bit, I guess, about the policies for a minute.
Yeah.
And then we can kind of get into like how we think about the dynamics of this. And I mean, the one thing I want to say out loud so I don't forget, but the question of, can you mobilize these specific policies during the campaign season to change people's views in terms of these broader currents, right? So the idea is, for the most obvious example, maybe we'll come back to school, education maybe a little bit later because it's such a complicated area. But for example, does requiring an armed guard on every public school campus during school hours, which saw 76% support, including 59% of Democrats,
Right.
does that make Texans feel like schools are safer?
Well, and then if we go back then to the other side and say, at the issue level, do you approve or disapprove of what the legislature has done on school safety? 35% approve, 42% disapprove.
And further, fewer than 20% think the legislature has done anything sufficient to improve school safety when asked about their confidence in that.
Right. And so
that's such a great it's a great example because it really lays out this dynamic here, right? Now, it doesn't mean that this is fixed in perpetuity, and that's sort of the point going forward is, it's going to be the job of legislative candidates to come out and say, not only did we fix the grid, but this is how we fixed the grid. This is how we did it. But I think, looking at this data, it sort of makes you, I think the question, and just makes me wonder is how effective are they going to be at that given this sort of overwhelmingly widespread, set of attitudes?
Right. And you can, it's interesting. So you could basically, and we haven't quite done this. This is really, for us, it's a whiteboard exercise that then hopefully would result in some kind of making sense of this. But, as I'm sitting here looking at my notes, you can probably hear me writing on the recording. Sorry, they'll probably edit it out because they're so great. But, if you look at, for example, you can find all these examples where either there's something – the approval levels on the specific issues more or less correspond to the general policy, but then to the general policy approvals. But you can also find the opposite, and sometimes within the same area. In a way, that's kind of the point, right?
Exactly. So this kind of goes back to I think how we think about maybe about polling and maybe about politics in some ways. I think it's related here.
Yeah.
And why we ask so many questions and why we ask it in different ways, right? So on the one hand, we have this, 16 policy areas where we ask people to approve or disapprove of the legislature. We have these 16 specific policies that we think, were in the discussion enough that people should, have a reaction to or might have a reaction to. And in some ways, we're trying to do a lot of different things with both of these, both on their own and together. And I think it's worth just for a moment kind of trying to explain that, right? I think, when we're looking at the broad policy areas, and even broad evaluations, what we're really trying to understand is what are the cross currents here? As you pointed out, you said something key there before, which is, there's no direction in the question.
Right.
We're asking the voter to provide us the direction. There's another type of question we ask a lot, which is about, whether or not a law or, should be more strict, less strict, or left as it is now. So, for example, should abortion policies and laws be more strict? Should gun laws be more strict, less strict? And this gives us just a sense, what's the temperature?
Yeah.
And what we're trying to figure out here is when we talk about cross currents, we're trying to figure out what's the temperature, what's important to the electorate, where are they leaning on that policy? But it doesn't tell us where we should land, right? The policies are going to ultimately be the political, the elites' interpretation of how they can best, mobilize what's at their disposal to deal with the current cross currents. But really, when we assess them, all we're kind of looking at is, well, what are the guardrails? And sometimes we find a guardrail, sometimes we don't.
Right.
So for example, abortion's an interesting area where there's a clear guardrail, and we're over it. We're past it.
Right, we crashed through that a while ago.
We crashed through that a while ago, and ultimately
about a year ago.
And ultimately,
Well, actually, in Texas, we crashed through it.
we crashed through it a while ago.
Several years ago.
But the thing is, but views in that policy area have remained negative, and they don't change because we've gone through the guardrail. And some of this stuff we see, just because you haven't hit a guardrail doesn't mean that you've necessarily done a good job, and that's kind of part of the piece here, right? I think transportation policy is the great example of this, and we've talked about this.
Speaking of guardrails,
yeah. Well, no, listen. Hey,
that's I
got a good night's sleep.
That's a good consonant metaphor.
I got a good night's sleep here. We talk about polling in transportation is interesting because essentially what you find is that whatever you ask voters, do you think we should add more roads? Do you think we should increase HOV lanes, so on and so forth, whatever? And generally, people will say, yeah. I support all those things. I support anything that might reduce traffic. And then we say, do you think this is going to reduce traffic? No. No, I don't think so, but I'm happy to see you try.
Right.
And I think, there's some sense with some of these where you kind of look at it, you say, well, yeah, sure. I think it's a good idea. I mean, I kind of think go back to the beginning of this, it's it would take, do I think that keeping, an armed guard on school campuses might increase safety? Yeah, I think it might. But do I think it significantly improves safety in campuses? Probably not. But that's where the political dynamic comes in terms of mobilizing this. But you look at this set of issues, and it's hard not to come away and say, from my perspective, and say, I'm curious to see how the campaigns treat this set of issues, the things they've done, and whether or not the voters, both Republicans and Democrats, and that's the key here. This is not just Democrats, whether Republicans, Democrats, and independents buy that rationale. We've made schools safer because we did this. We made the grid more reliable because we did that. We, lowered your property. We lowered your property taxes because we did this. And this is why property taxes is such a difficult issue, because you know what? The voters are going to get a scorecard back, and it's called their property tax assessment.
Right. And it's that doesn't come from an interest group or
that's just
somebody that a third of the 2/3 of the electorate is going to ignore, while a third
it doesn't come from
maybe
Newsmax or
pays attention to
MSNBC.
it. Right.
It comes in your mailbox.
And so to kind of wind this together, I mean, having swimmer, gone wading around in the subtleties and the complexities. We started with thinking about where people are with the legislature in this moment. I think it's worth pointing out that when you tie all these things together, despite the differences between the specifics of policy and the assessments in the general policy areas and all of the dynamics we're talking about, ratings were relatively low within the logic of each battery.
Yeah.
In areas that have been either demonstrated as salient to voters or important in a way of having staked out public attempts to set the agenda by elites and opinion leaders. So if you look at the specific policy proposals, where we said they were significantly higher, and we went over several of those were in the 70s, et cetera. But the ones that scored the lowest are pretty interesting, right?
Well,
so only 41.
The ones that scored the highest were pretty interesting too.
Well,
go ahead.
So at the bottom, only 41% supported and 35% opposed, reducing the power of cities and counties to pass laws and regulations in areas where state and local governments have traditionally shared authority, right? In other words, the preemption bill, the state preemption bill. Or, if you must, the Death Star bill. Second from the bottom, 49% supported and 34% opposed, prohibiting DEI at universities and colleges. Now, both of those passed.
Right.
And then to round that out, 55% supported and 37% opposed, prohibiting public school libraries from containing any materials that describe, depict, or portray sexual content. Now, that's a good example of a bill that evolved over the process and was made more palatable in a way that is actually less draconian, I would argue, in terms of being a direct prohibition in terms of the language of the question.
But what we know about both of those issues as an example is that neither were very high on voters' lists. When we asked specifically either, in reference to the preemption bill, we asked, open-ended questions on both polls on both the February and April poll about what the legislature should be focused on, as well as sort of an assessment of, what should be the most important priorities of the legislature and closed-ended questions. And this idea of preemption or, basically, cities run amok did not come up.
Right.
Did not come up. And also when we looked at, priorities for the public ed space in the Texas legislature, removing these books from libraries did not come up. Now, ultimately, again, to speak to your, idea of the evolution of this, we were pointing about this previously because the scope of it was broader, not in the legislature, but in the discussion, right? The idea was, you had county library systems who were taking books off the shelves.
Right.
And in general, when we asked about that, that was not popular.
Right. Okay, but to connect this, now to connect this with the other more general policy areas, if you look at the lowest assessments in those general policy areas,
right,
we saw a combination of things that they didn't do, but also things that they did they did try to do to some extent. But this is also, suggests also why these overall numbers may be low. So, again, going roughly from the bottom of the assessment of general policies up, only 25% approved of what the legislature did on, wait for it, property taxes. 45% disapproved, net -20, right? Pretty close to that on mental health services. And this is an interesting one, I think, that we haven't talked about much, but is worth putting a pin in. Same, 25% approved, slightly, but statistically similar, lower. Disapproval, 25-38, net -13. And then the grid at 28 approved, 44 disapproved. Now, that's something they did act on. Net -16. And then we can pick one of the 28s. We'll go to political corruption and ethics, 28% approved, 42% disapprove, net -14. So what do we have if we step back and look at that? And it's worth then saying, right behind all those, and just to make the point, public education and gun violence were both at 30%.
And, I've been talking about, the political geography and the importance of the suburbs.
Right.
What's really interesting is there were 6 issues that saw at least 47% disapproval among suburban voters, and they're important ones. They were school safety, gun violence, immigration and border security, political corruption and ethics, the grid, and property taxes.
Right. So for all right. So and the suburbs obviously kind of ground zero for where what fights there are electorally are taking place. But if you take a look at if you then look at those specific issues and look at where the negative ratings are on the general issues and the specific issues, it's not shocking to see that the overall assessments are not very good and a little bit lower than we've seen in the historical trajectory of these kinds of ratings.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I think it would be unfair not to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the issues we're talking about here that's seeing these negative ratings are tough issues, right? I mean, and they're tougher still in Texas maybe than in some other places because of the specifics of the state. But, if you think about property taxes, we've gone over ad nauseum about the complexity of that. But anything having to do
with the same with the grid.
The grid is incredibly complicated.
And they actually did something on that, but
again, we'll see if voters feel. I mean,
we see that so far they don't feel particularly reassured.
The grid is the greatest example as a way to illustrate all the others, which is you kind of have to ask yourself this question. If explained what the legislature did, if explained in simple terms what the legislature did to a normal person, would that normal person feel more confident that their power is not going to go off? Yes or no?
Right.
And if you feel like they might not even understand the explanation, that's probably a problem. Right. And so that's sort of the thing here is, how do you translate this into the feeling of voters that this thing got dealt with? But none of these issues are simple. The border is not simple. Public education and school safety, not simple. And we've gone through why it would be so difficult to craft a policy solution in some ways to the idea of like gun violence in schools or gun violence generally. And so, part of this is the fact that, the legislature has some really tough issues in some ways to deal with, but the constraints of the state, in terms of the political culture, in terms of, our revenue mechanisms and all these other things, make it, just sort of a state of affairs at this point that, they've got a tough job really kind of for the foreseeable future. I mean, even if there is some big sea change all of a sudden, then, Texas turns blue finally, like people ask about.
Is that your prediction?
No, I don't make predictions, Jim. No predictions here. But let's say Texas turns blue at some point in the next few election cycles. Democrats are going to have a real hard time dealing with the same set of issues. It's not like Democrats are going to come in and have all the solutions on this stuff because it's just not possible.
Well, I think that's, A, right, and B, that's given some love to the governing class and the difficulty of their job. But I think it's also, it's what makes this interesting, but also this moment very difficult is that, and I think we sort of, it's good to return to something that we just observed as in passing a few moments ago to kind of get to closing out is that, there is a kind of decline. I don't know. Decline is probably not the right way, although empirically verifiable probably. But, the fact that the base level of expectations that government institutions are going to effectively address problems, we're in a trough right now, right? And I think so. When I think, I was thinking about your grid example, for example. Yes, political leaders have tried and will continue to try to find a way to summarize this incredibly complex solution, quote unquote, or, whatever, the action that they've taken, simplify it to try to reassure voters. I think voters' openness to reassurance, not particularly high right now, independent of, almost entirely independent of anything they're doing at this point in time because of the long, the various factors that have evolved running up to this. So I tend to like political people and they're interesting people. I think in some ways, they suffer from a lack of realistic assessment of what motivates political actors and elected officials. And a lot of low expectations there, some of which are deserved, but some of which I think are sometimes a little bit sideways about what your expectations should be of an elected official to begin with.
Well, I mean, in an environment in which, a lot of times elected officials are the ones cultivating those low expectations, it kind of ultimately...
actually what I would say is simultaneously cultivating the low, earning the low expectations while cultivating the higher ones.
Right, exactly.
Right, might be is kind of how I would think about it. But
exactly.
So takeaway, I would say go, have a look at this data. I hopefully this will help sort it out. As with a lot of the podcasts we do shortly after the polling data is released, helpful to have something to follow along with at home.
For sure.
And so, again, I'll urge you all to go and our listeners to go and look at the data that we'll post with this podcast, but also generally, we've got a lot of ways to go find the data at the website. There's a polling search engine in that polling section. There's a data archive. There's a latest poll page that will present all of the stuff we have here that
search it by keyword.
Searchable by keyword. Exactly. So I urge you all to do that. I think with the holiday week coming, we're also our schedule for July will be pretty slim. So you may not hear from us for a while, though we may wind up fitting one more in.
We just like it so much.
We'll see what we'll see what people like that. We may be back tomorrow.
Who knows? Let's record another. Want to do another one right after this?
So we'll be a little spotty in July, as summer sets in. But keep an eye out, and please keep an eye out on the website. We'll continue to probably put out some content on the website over the summer because we can't really help it. So at the same URL, if you go to texaspolitics.utexas.edu, on any of the blog posts, you'll find a sign-up sheet for our mailing, which is, a little irregular, but, I say that in a good way that, if you sign up, you're not going to get stuff every day. I actually signed up for a couple of things on one of the posting platforms, and I've got to go shut off notifications because it's making me crazy.
We guarantee you will not get something every day from us.
Right, you will not get something every day from us. So with that, thanks again to Josh for being here and on a hot summer day. Thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts here at UT Austin, who has done just a great job over the the life of this podcast, but the team in the studio right now I think is particularly good, and we really appreciate you. Thank you for listening. Stay cool and healthy out there, and we'll be back at some point in the not too distant future with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.